All right, so this is the sixth mini lecture video on Master and Emissary I've recorded. This one's over chapter 5, the primacy of the right hemisphere. I liked this chapter a lot more than I actually remembered. I mean, I liked the whole book when I read it originally, but I read it. This is probably the closest this semester that I've read this chapter since the very first time. So I reread it pretty closely, and I really forgot how much I liked the later chapters of the book. I really liked this chapter, and then the chapters after it. I know I also like because I've been kind of looking ahead today, and the past few days actually. So it's a really good chapter, and um, there's a couple things I noticed about it. Consistent with what I said last lecture video, at the end of the book, these last few chapters we're going to be reading, the focus of things of the book is more on kind of connecting the ideas on hemispheric asymmetry, kind of the science ideas, to some of these bigger picture ideas, these speculations um, that the author makes, kind of going beyond the evidence. So that stuff is kind of entertaining just because it's interesting to think of the different possible kind of predictions or the interpretations of all of that cognitive neuroscience research that has been talked about regarding hemispheric differences. But the other thing is this chapter simultaneously does have a lot of science, cognitive neuroscience citations and findings which are talked about. So it's kind of the best of like both worlds. There's a lot of rigor in the sense that there's a good amount of articles that are cited backing up some of the claims which are made. But there's also a decent amount of speculation of theorizing, saying things that there's not necessarily a study which has proved that the specific claim is true. So some speculating, a nice combination of both. It's first an example of a study which he does provide, um, actual evidence for. Expressive gesture is like, when you're talking and you're doing stuff like this and you're just kind of moving your hands or whatever, different parts of your body, usually it's your hands, versus sign language or an instrumental gesture. So these kind of two different ways of using your hand. One where you're just kind of like doing it really without thinking about it, just when you're talking, how people kind of just use their hands for some reason. That's expressive gesture versus sign language or instrumental gesture, which would be more like a formal sign language where the different motions have specific meanings. They mean specific words. He provided evidence that expressive gesture relies more on the right hemisphere and sign language relies more on the left hemisphere. So these two different motor behaviors with the hands, both clearly cognitively different for the producer and the person who's like seeing or interpreting those hand signals. It appears that they involve different hemispheres of the brain. But yeah, I'll do kind of what I've been doing recently. Um, just kind of go through some of the quotes and connect, help kind of see what they're saying, what these quotes are saying about some of the bigger picture ideas, bigger picture speculations in the book, these connections between the cognitive neuroscience and these bigger picture ideas related to society and mental health and art and philosophy. So yeah, and as the chapter name emphasizes, this chapter is mostly about the right hemisphere, but you kind of notice if you look closely in each hemisphere, each chapter rather, he always has to talk about both hemispheres, because if you're going to describe the right, you kind of do so and say, and this is how the left hemisphere is different. But this chapter does focus a lot on the right hemisphere. So here's a quote: "The best things in life hide from the full glare of focused attention." And so some examples would be like, I think these are probably the best, like jokes or metaphors or art. These are the things where, like a joke in particular, the full glare of focused attention is kind of like when someone explains a joke, instead of you just getting it kind of, as the joke occurs. If someone has to explain, oh, it's funny for these reasons, and then they have to explain the reason why a joke is funny, then the joke is kind of in the full glare of focused attention, and it's not really funny in that way. So jokes don't really work that well if you're paying too much attention, which is kind of like metaphors. These things are jokes, metaphors, art seem to be more effective or more emotionally stimulating if there is an aspect of ambiguity, maybe, or uncertainty. Definitely the thing you want, though, is to not have these things be under the, as he says, the full glare of focused attention. Jokes work better if you kind of let the connection just kind of happens naturally, where you don't have to like think about it and deduce why the joke is funny. Some other things that follow this quote: the best things in life hide from the full glare of focused attention. That would be sleep. That's an interesting one, I thought. The idea is that you can't, yeah, sleeping is something that you do best when you're not thinking about sleeping, I think is what they're saying here, or he says here, is what he's suggesting here. Oh, and this is another example I really like: characters or actors, and like a play or movie. The the thing you're watching, the drama, the play or the movie or the television show works better if you're just kind of immersed in the story. You don't want to be thinking with the full glare of focused attention that the person on there isn't actually the character, that that's actually just an actor, and then the person's voice doesn't even really sound like what it does in the movie, that the actor is just doing an impersonation. You don't want the full glare of focused attention on those aspects of movies. You just want to kind of ignore some of those things, and it makes the movie more effective, more enjoyable. Um, he also said things like love and sex. Um, to be honest, I did not completely know what he was implying here. Um, Acting natural makes sense. If you're trying to act natural and you think about it too much, then it seems like you're not acting natural anymore. Being innocent, I think that one makes some sense as well. So some of these are all examples provided in the book. Some of these make more sense to me than others. The ones that make a lot of sense, yeah, the jokes one, the characters, things in a movie, um, and acting natural. Those are like my three favorite examples that support this idea. I'm pretty clear by now, though, that the left hemisphere is the hemisphere that McGilchrist thinks is capable of the full glare of focused attention. Um, so yeah, some interesting things. So this is a quote about the kind of the left hemisphere, paraphrased. McGilchrist suggests that schizophrenia is, and this is kind of using his language closely, schizophrenia simulates an overactive left hemisphere. And he also does cite some neurology studies of people that have schizophrenia. They have right hemisphere lesions, and they have some schizophrenia type symptoms. They might not necessarily have full schizophrenia, but some of the symptoms of schizophrenia can be can occur with lesions of the right hemisphere in particular, which supports this idea that schizophrenia is something that occurs when the left hemisphere is by far the more dominant or stronger hemisphere. If the right hemisphere is injured, that's going to mean that the left hemisphere is going to have to take up even more of the slack, and presumably, or the theory that's presented is that's one of the ways schizophrenia happens. Left hemisphere becomes too strong. Um, yeah, so with the primacy of the right hemisphere, they talk a lot about this idea that the right hemisphere is implicit or unconscious, whereas the left hemisphere is explicit, more conscious. And what's cool about this is that's kind of like a theory which has been around for a while. The idea that the right hemisphere process is more likely to process things like in an unconscious way, and the left hemisphere is more likely to process things in a conscious way. There's, I would say, some decent empirical evidence in support of that I was aware of even before I read this book. But this book kind of supports this idea as well, of course. Um, and so part of the primacy, or part of the importance of the right hemisphere, has to do with the fact that emotion is more of a right hemisphere type of phenomenon. It's not only right hemisphere. There's definitely emotions involved with the left hemisphere. In fact, there's kind of slightly different emotions in the left hemisphere. But there is something about the emotions in the right hemisphere which is qualitatively different arguably stronger than the emotions that are generated by the left hemisphere. Uh, and and this is because emotion, McGilchrist is basically claiming an interesting claim, which is some evidence supports it, that emotion, you know, hard to define thing, but emotion, this general idea of emotion, is something which is inherently embodied, meaning emotion, those, different states that you feel, sad, happy, angry, scared, etc., are inherently embodied. Which, yeah, so the evidence is pretty good for this, because there's a lot of evidence that supports the idea that physiologically you experience different kind of physiological things relating to, like, your heart rate, or your breathing, neurotransmitters, hormones. There are definitely lots of things physiologically in the body which differentiate different emotional states. Another one that's a good one is like muscle tension. For instance, like feeling uh, emotions relate to like anxiety and stuff, or anger is likely to increase muscle tension. So all these different feelings, all these different emotional states have kind of a corresponding profile of physiological activities that occur. So emotion is embodied, but emotion is also implicit, in the sense that emotion is something which is like you feel, and you could maybe describe what you're feeling, but the words that describe an emotion, like, are always missing the qualitative feeling of the emotion itself. So you can say I'm sad to someone else, but that person is not going to actually know exactly what you felt by that word sad, because what you felt is like something that only the person with the body who's feeling sad can experience subjectively, have a qualitative understanding of. So emotion is more of a right hemisphere thing, because it's physiological, it's embodied, and emotions are hard to verbalize. At least they're hard to really capture the full essence of emotions when you verbalize them, something the left hemisphere would do. So emotions are kind of more implicit. There's something you feel, but they're not necessarily, they're more on the implicit side, not explicit. Like, language tends to be things that you state, facts and language are more on the explicit side, the more on the conscious side. Emotion is thought to be more on the kind of unconscious side. And there's more evidence for this as well. Like, subtle things about your mood that you might not even be aware of. Your underlying mood can influence kind of your decision making processes and even your perception of the world. So emotion has kind of some subtle, maybe even like insidious influences on your behavior, because you're not always consciously aware of your emotional state, but emotional state certainly influences your behavior. Some more stuff. Another reason I really like this chapter is because Julian Jaynes, this book, Origin of Consciousness, in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, which is a book which is talked about in several different chapters in Master and His Emissary, and a really good one. These two books really go, Master and His Emissary and Origin of Consciousness, really go well together. They kind of speak to each other, and they're both really interesting. They both have a lot to do with hemispheric asymmetry and kind of these big philosophical ideas. An idea presented in the Origin of Consciousness, which was published before Master and His Emissaries, this idea that the right hemisphere is more unconscious, it's more implicit. The left hemisphere is more conscious and explicit. That's basically where this idea came from, the Origin of Consciousness, by Julian Jaynes. And McGilchrist kind of expands on this idea some in the book. And then, yeah, so here's, I already mentioned kind of this finding earlier, but expressive gesture, what you're doing when you're just talking without really thinking about it, those expressive gestures tend to correspond to the right hemisphere. And then sign language is different type of gesture, relies more on the left hemisphere. So another quote, the left hemisphere is a useful department to send things to for processing, but the things only have meaning once again when they are returned to the right hemisphere. So this is starting to get to an interesting part of interesting nuance of the theory presented in the Master and His Emissary, that there's kind of this sequence of events that occur, in the brain for, like, I guess you could say, for conscious thought, any type of thought or any type of perception of the world. According to McGilchrist, there's kind of this sequence that occurs. And part of that sequence is that the things which are processed in the left hemisphere, we've already talked about how the left hemisphere is disembodied. It categorizes things, it abstracts, it is what understands the world by categorizing things, and it does so in a way which is kind of removed from the body. It is the less embodied hemisphere, but it does things. But McGilchrist makes this idea that after the left hemisphere does things, it sends that information back to the right hemisphere. And that's supposedly like fundamental or important for you and for us to be able to understand something, to have a conscious thought. According to McGilchrist, basically, the left hemisphere helps categorize that thought in certain ways. And then that information, you're not going to truly kind of understand what you're thinking about. So that left hemisphere information can be sent back to the right hemisphere, where McGilchrist says the idea or the thought is grounded by the right hemisphere. He doesn't really, this is more of like a metaphor that he doesn't actually kind of strictly define. He does use this other term, reintegration. And that's the thing that occurs when, like, the signals, the representation for something in the left hemisphere is sent back to the right, where it's reintegrated. He would say things like, it rejoins the whole. And I have some more good quotes that I think will kind of help flesh this idea out about this interaction between the left and right hemisphere. Here's a really good example, by the way, of this, the way the two hemispheres are supposed to work together. So a musical performer, a pianist, or whatever musical instrument, has to learn a song, a difficult song to play on the piano. And the way a lot of musicians, presumably all musicians, learn a difficult piece is they kind of break it down. The pianist painstakingly or consciously fragments a piece of music during practice. So fragments means breaks it down into its kind of pieces and analyzes kind of some of the individual notes, some of the individual phrases, and then we'll practice those difficult passages until the musician understands, how to play, or has, the muscle memory that allows the musician to play it easily. And the whole purpose of this, the musician during practice applies very much focused, conscious attention on the music or the notes on the page, and what the body is doing while trying to play, what the fingers are doing, what the arms are doing, hands are doing, while actually playing the song. But eventually, the goal is to be able to play the song with minimal consciousness, with minimal effort, without having to really think about it at all. And so that's what this example is saying. This is the idea that when you're painstakingly or consciously fragmenting a piece of music during practice, that's you using your left hemisphere. You're making aspects of the song explicit. You're consciously paying attention to them, consciously processing or analyzing the kind of individual notes or individual passages. That's a left hemisphere type of thing, the full glare of focused attention. And you use those abilities of the left hemisphere to kind of zoom in like a laser beam or focus in on something, to make it so that information can eventually be kind of incorporated with the right hemisphere, the embodied, or the less conscious hemisphere, the one that can do things without having to pay, focused attention to do them. He admits this isn't a perfect example, but I like it. The left hemisphere is painstakingly and consciously fragmenting a piece, paying attention to the different specific parts of a music. But then that information is eventually sent back to the right hemisphere, and it's the right hemisphere which is able to perform the actual concert, the actual show. It's able to take in all that knowledge from the consciousness, and then is able to form like an automatic, like a routine that can be performed. Just, the right hemisphere is embodied. The right hemisphere just kind of knows how to do it. There's a memory which has been formed. the body, the muscles in your body just know how to do it. Automaticity is what a term which is often used to describe this. So the focus of the left hemisphere during practice is then transferred to the right hemisphere to allow the piece to be played without the full glare of consciousness, for the piece to just be played by muscle memory, feel alone. A related quote. Well, this is kind of okay. So it is kind of related to this, but this is actually also related to some of the stuff that was talked about in the last chapter. Some of the big picture ideas about the left hemisphere. This quote: "The left hemisphere grasps, sees, receives only some of what the right hemisphere has received." So here, it's basically what's being suggested here is that the first thing that happens when you are perceiving an object out in the world, or recognizing something out in the world, or having any type of conscious thought, I think McGilchrist would agree, the first thing that happens is the right hemisphere does something. The right hemisphere, it receives, kind of, if you think about, or sorry, the Adam that I showed you last time, the creation of man, Adam kind of holding out his hands, his left arm, that's kind of the right hemisphere, which kind of is the receptor. It receives the beginning of a thought, or the beginning of a perception, is the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is the one that's able to kind of process like the thing in its truest form. Like it gathers all of the information about like the truest form of a thing. But then that information is sent to the left hemisphere, but the left hemisphere is only able to see a small subset. The hemisphere kind of forms these categories. It has that spotlight of attention. What that spotlight of attention does is it's able to see an aspect of the reality of something. The reality of something really will be super complex. Any given object, the reality is complex, more complex than we could possibly ever like comprehend. What the left hemisphere does is it simplifies. It takes a very complicated thing out in the world and it categorizes that thing. It focuses in on that thing in just a simplified way. And so in this way, even though the left hemisphere, a lot of the signals from the right hemisphere are sent over the left hemisphere only deals with like a small subset of the information about a given object, which is sent from the right to the left. It receives only some of what the right hemisphere initially received. And then presumably the left hemisphere does some type of processing, some type of, conscious fragmenting of something, and then that information goes back to the right hemisphere. So that's kind of one of the main interesting theories about this book. In fact, it's kind of this right to left to right hemisphere idea. This is pretty novel I don't know of anyone else who's come up with a theory like this. The right hemisphere is kind of like the initiator of any conscious thought, and then it sends the signal to the left hemisphere, where the left hemisphere does it abstracts, many of the conscious aspects and categorization occurs in the left hemisphere, and then things are sent back to the right hemisphere, where the thought is grounded. Where the thought is grounded, whatever that means, or reintegrated. But the idea is that this process, right to left to right, is what allows conscious awareness to occur, and closing the loop or grounding or reintegrating is important for the final process. Going right, left, and then reintegrating by going back to the right is presumably important for having the conscious experience itself. So here's a couple more quotes at the end of the chapter. And they're kind of long, so I think I'll just read some of these. These are pictures from my book. What is offered by the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere is offered back again and taken up into a synthesis involving both hemispheres. That synthesis is that reintegration stuff I was just talking about. This must be true of processes of creativity, of the understanding of works of art, of the development of the religious sense. In each, there is progress from an intuitive apprehension of whatever it may be. That's the beginning of the process. That's the right hemisphere. Via a more formal process of enrichment through conscious, detailed, analytic understanding. That's the left hemisphere there. to a new, enhanced, intuitive understanding of this whole, now transformed by the process that has undergone. That's reintegration. That's being grounded by the right hemisphere, the end of the process. Right to left to right is kind of the process which he's claiming is occurring for any conscious thought in your brain. The left hemisphere seems to play a crucial role in determining what comes into being. It is part of the process of creation. Applying linear sequential analysis, what the left hemisphere does, forces the implicit into explicitness. That's like this idea of categorizing. That's what the left hemisphere does. It's taking kind of these implicit things about it, like the implicit truths about something, and it makes them explicit by focusing in on just some of those aspects of a given object. The categorization is making something explicit. When you categorize something, that's assumed in this book to basically be like making something explicit. The left hemisphere makes things explicit. It brings clarity. The clarity is crucial for helping understand that one part or that specific aspect that we are aware of. But the important thing is, by doing that, part of the whole, like the aspects of the whole, parts of the truth about the object are lost. When the left hemisphere does its thing, it makes something explicit. It focuses in on a specific part of something. It does so, and it comes at a cost. And the cost is that there are aspects of truth about the object which the left hemisphere has no idea about. And that's what it means to say, but in doing this, the whole is lost. The left hemisphere can only see a part. It misses kind of the whole or the full truth about something. And this may be one of the most interesting ideas. I really like this idea, even though it's very, very speculative. Was kind of connecting some of these ideas to quantum physics, which obviously we're not experts on quantum physics here in this class. But I have included a good YouTube video right here, which talks, it's like a 6-minute video that talks about the double slit experiment and some ideas which are kind of relevant to help kind of explain what's going on here when Miguel Christ is talking about Schrodinger's cat. But I'll kind of read this anyway, even though if you want to have a full understanding of it, you'll probably have to watch that video. Truth is concealing as well as an unconcealing. The difficulty is an expression of the fundamental incompatibility involved in mounting the vertical axis at the same time as the horizontal axis. So that's like a metaphor for the left and right hemispheres at the same time. Living seems to force us, like Schrodinger's cat, into some sort of limiting option. It seems that we cannot achieve specificity in observation, presumably that's what the left hemisphere does, and at the same time preserve the other characteristics of the object of our attention. So it's hard to kind of see the object as a whole to understand the full truth about something, and then simultaneously be able to have this specificity and observation. So the specificity observation is like what the left hemisphere supposedly does, and the other characteristics of the object of our attention is what the right hemisphere presumably does. The right hemisphere represents all of the possible truths about something. And what the left hemisphere does, once again, it becomes conscious of only a subset of those truths. I think this is the last slide here. And this is actually about a chapter that you didn't have to read, but I wanted to include this stuff because there was a couple things that I think there's a couple people who I've talked to, and then they're doing papers that I think this might be relevant. And I don't want them to not see this stuff because I think this stuff could be helpful for some people on their paper topic. So at the beginning of this chapter, The Triumph of the Left Hemisphere, there's a lot of good stuff about interhemispheric communication, inhibition using the corpus callosum. So we definitely read about some stuff like that at the beginning of the book, but this is probably the most detailed part of the entire book about inhibition and the corpus callosum. And it's important for people who are going to write topic 1 about, some of these bigger picture speculations in the master and his emissary, to kind of understand why this kind of discussion, why this topic of inhibition in the corpus callosum would be talked about at the beginning of this chapter called the triumph of the left hemisphere. That's something, especially if you're doing this topic for topic 1, inhibition via the corpus callosum, or the function of the corpus callosum. This is something, understanding why this occurs at the beginning of the chapter called the triumph of the left hemisphere would be important for you to demonstrate, as far as like the understanding the bigger picture implications of this idea, why this occurs at the beginning of the chapter called the triumph of the left hemisphere. And then there's one last quote that I wanted to read. So I'll start in the underlined part. If we subject a work of arts, say, or even a human body, to detached analytic attention, that's what the left hemisphere supposedly does, we lose the sense of the thing itself. So that sense of the thing itself would be like the whole truth about the thing. That's what the right hemisphere, presumably, what it has. So if we subject a work of art or human body to detached analytic attention, we lose the sense of the thing itself and its being, and all its wholeness and otherness recedes. But the result of such tension, provided it is then relinquished, so that we stand in a state of openness and receptivity before that thing again, may be a deeper and richer presencing, or you could say understanding. This is kind of a final little paragraph explaining that right to left to right process that McGilchrist kind of talks about in these chapters, in the previous chapter on primacy of the right hemisphere, and then this chapter on the triumph of the left hemisphere. The way that the hemispheres are supposed to work together. The left hemisphere can use its kind of analytic attention, the disembodied categorization, to analyze something. And then that works best if that information is then sent back to the right hemisphere, where that information could be reintegrated to allow the right hemisphere to do its job even better than it had before. That information from the left hemisphere is supposed to work with the right hemisphere to make it even better and stronger, and to be able to do what it's supposed to do even better. Though that isn't always what happens, of course, in the book, because McGilchrist does talk about how the left hemisphere has become too dominant. So I think that is everything. Well, yes, once again, I have talked with people like most days. The past week, I've talked with 1 or 2 people every day, and I'm still happy to do that. So please feel free to make an appointment with me if you want to have a Zoom meeting.